All right. This last session about our history is going to focus on some new challenges. I'm going to talk specifically about three events that I feel like that anybody who is desiring to understand where the Church of God Mountain Assembly is right now, they have to understand these three events from the same time frame, roughly 2000 to 2004. If you don't understand these three things, you will not understand where the Church of God Mountain Assembly is at right now. So for ministers coming into our organization, they hear discussion that is related to to these three things, and having some background helps quite a bit. If you've got a young minister, for example, that's come into the assembly in the last few years for the first time, hearing discussion about any one of these three topics, you don't have a clue what's going on. And it's so critical to understanding where the Church of God Mountain Assembly is today. And so I want to talk about those three things tonight. And the first one is the Church of God Mountain Assembly's benevolent program. And I want to talk about the retirement benefit for our ministers. And so we'll begin by looking at the need for a retirement or benefit program. In 1935, the U.S. government, the Congress passed the Social Security Act. And it was modeled after a European system. The idea was that people who have worked and labored and contributed, they ought to be able to reach a point in time in their life where they have enough financial security that they can depend on not having to work until the day they die in order to be able to make it. So the government created a Social Security benefit by taxing employment, by taxing wages, so that when a person reached the age of 65, that they might be able to have a supplement to their income and not have to work as hard as they did when they were 40 or 45 or what, and then also to provide other benefits. But 20 years later, the Church of God Mountain Assembly recognized we've got pastors who are pastoring, giving their life, but sometimes they're pastoring without any kind of pay whatsoever from the church. Other times they're giving their heart and life to the ministry. The church might be doing what they can to financially help them. We need to do what we can to take care of our aged ministers. And so in 1954, a committee of J.H. Bryant, R.N. Ballinger, and Ira Moses was established to develop an aged ministers pension fund. And so they reported in 1955, they still hadn't completed, didn't have a working model ready. And so they would work on it and report again at an elders meeting. In 1956, placed under the jurisdiction of the Board of Elders was this plan that was developed by the committee with the understanding that the contributors are subject to the guidelines established by the General Council, and that payments may be changed due to the availability of funds. And so we've got an idea, we're going to try to make this work, but at the same time, if you participate, you also need to know that it all depends on whether or not we're going to be able to, the assembly doesn't have the option that the government has, that if there's no money, go ahead and pay it anyway. It just doesn't work like that. And so the Board of Elders would approve every applicant for the pension. It was open to ministers who have been actively engaged in the Church of God Mountain Assembly for the past 15 years and have attained the age of 60, so long as he subscribed at the time of the adoption of the plan. And so for ministers that wanted to get involved and what have you, they need to get on board right away. Active ministry it was the understanding notion. And so the idea was that if the principal occupation has been preaching the gospel, pastoring a church, or regularly engaged in evangelistic work. And so the idea wasn't so much for the bivocational pastor or the pastor that was that was working a secular job and who also happened to be pastoring. But for ministers whose principal income derived from the ministry, they would have this plan available to them. And here's where it started. The minister would receive $1 a month for each consecutive year of service. Okay? So $1 times the number of years of service that he had contributed, plus a rightful amount determined by the Board of Elders. And so let me say that inflation of $1, in $1 in 1955 is about $9 now. So we're not talking about a whole lot of money even then, but the elders could add to the amount that would be given. If there was also a cap, so that no minister would get more than $65 a month. Now again, multiply that times a little over 9, and you'll see about where the benefit. Again, this is a supplement to income, much the way that Social Security is. But at the same time, it was something and not nothing. So if a minister was inactive, he forfeits the claim. If his ministry is revoked, he ceases to draw. The aged widow of a minister that's in good standing is entitled to half the amount of her husband's at the time of his death. And so for the aged widow, she could also draw at least a portion of what her husband, provided she's lived with him for at least the last 15 years of the ministry. Now the question is, how's a program like this funded? Well, any minister who makes more than $50 a month from ministry was asked to send 50 cents a month to the fund. And so it would put a little bit of money in the fund in the same way that your wage would be withheld from Social Security.
That's pretty much what I was going to say. So it's like basically a deduction from your paycheck.
Except that it was totally voluntary. The minister wanted to participate. He, looking ahead, whatever, he could immediately start putting that money into that. If he made more than $50 a month, he was taxed. But again, it was a voluntary contribution, voluntary participation in the program. Plus, one offering each year was asked from the local church to give toward the aged minister's pension fund. So they asked each church every year, take up one offering a year to give toward the aged minister's pension fund. They recommended Easter Sunday for the time. They also took 1% of all the funds coming to headquarters, besides missions. Missions was exempted, but all the other funds coming into headquarters, they would take 1% of that and put it into the fund. And so the idea was the hope that we can help those ministers who've been full-time in ministry, who don't have a pension, a retirement plan from the coal mine, or don't have a pension from GM or Ford or what have you, the men who have given full-time service to ministry, who don't have any other kind of retirement, other than Social Security, that they might be able to at least have a supplement from the headquarters. Every applicant was to be investigated by the executive board, who would refer to the board of 12 elders, and the 12 elders would determine the allotment, how much money. So that the executive board would determine whether or not they were eligible, and then the elder board would decide how much that they might receive. Disabled ministers may receive assistance also. Again, it's may, provided they have 15 years of service. The board had the power to invest monies that were given to the aged minister's pension. The board could invest it in such a way, in any way that they deemed necessary to return an investment. As long as there's no chance of loss, they wasn't taking it to the racetrack and betting on the ponies or nothing like that. But they had the power to invest the money to bring a return, but not the power to redirect. So they couldn't take the money and put it into something else. And so that was how the first plan was set up. In 1966, Paul Yeary from the Goshen Church presented a new minister's retirement plan. And the assembly will pay to the minister the smaller amount of 1/2 the amount that the minister paid into Social Security for minister's wages, or 1/2 the amount times the 10 times the amount of tithes. Let me back up. Basically, the tithes that a minister pays to headquarters is where the money would come from. We would give back, the assembly would give back to the minister up to 1/2 of the amount of tithes that he had paid that year, or 1/2 of the amount that he had paid into Social Security for Social Security taxes. Whichever one was the smaller. Now, the idea behind this was, if you worked in secular employment and you are taxed from Social Security, you are taxed 7.5% or 8.3%, whatever it is now, for Social Security and Medicare. Comes out of your paycheck automatically. That amount that is taken from your paycheck is matched by your employer. So that the total 16.5% or what have you is sent to the government. You pay half of it and your employer pays half of it. If you work in ministry and you get your money from the government, the church is not taxable. Church is not, the government can't tax the church. And so a minister, for Social Security purposes, a minister is self-employed when it comes to Social Security. He has to pay the entire 16.5% himself. And so the assembly said, you know what, we've created a situation where in the secular world, if a man's income is coming from secular employment, his employer pays half of his money into Social Security for him. We ought to at least give him something back. And so some men would take that money that was returned, the 1/2 Social Security, they would take that back and use it to help pay their taxes at the in April. They'd get that money back from headquarters, and they would pay that money, use that to pay 1/2 of their Social Security tax. And the idea was the man could either do that with it, or he could take that money and invest it in a retirement plan. So the man would get that money back. Again, this came out of the minister's tithes treasury. In 1978, a retirement committee was created. In 1976, a retirement committee was created for the purpose of establishing a better plan. Clayton Lawson, James Cox, and James Walden Jr., James Cox Jr., James Walden Jr., served on this committee. The committee reported the following year and was retained to continue working out a plan. In 1978, they presented a new plan. In addition to retaining the 1/2 Social Security benefit, we also created a participation in Nationwide Insurance Company's group retirement program, so that ministers had the option of investing on their own. They could put a portion of their salary directly into a retirement program that would be regulated by Nationwide Insurance Company. And so every ministering assembly had the opportunity to invest in their own retirement. And also, a third part of that, besides the 1/2 Social Security and the option of the retirement program, also we created a benevolent fund from 2% of the total minister's tithes receipts and 1% of the tithes receipts, so that we might provide a monthly allotment of $100 a month to ministers who have served at least 25 consecutive years in full-time ministry, who are 65 years old or older, and who have no other form of retirement other than Social Security. And the plan was set up in such a way that it would last no longer than 10 years. This is what we're going to do for the next 10 years. Again, replacing the aged minister's pension fund. The idea that we had we created a plan whereby we would give $100 a month to ministers who had served 25 consecutive years, 65 and older, who don't have any other income other than Social Security, and they could have that benefit for up to 10 years. They also, that year, the fourth part of the plan was to have a board of review on retirement with 3 members to review the plan and to make plans and make recommendations and serve as a liaison between Nationwide and the Church of God Mountain Assembly to regulate that minister's retirement plan. In 1983, the Nationwide item was dropped from the program. We only had 4 ministers who were participating, and 3 of them were general officials who the assembly was contributing their part of the plan. Nationwide had developed this plan anticipating 100 ministers be involved. That was not the case. And so in 1983, that part of the program was dropped. At the elders meeting in January 1986, and again, the plan established in 78 was going to expire in 10 years. And so in the elders meeting in January 1986, the elders formed a committee to study the current program and to work out a plan to continue to develop it. The committee was Fred Cornelius, Leon Petrie, James Earl Pruitt, Lonnie Light, and Jerome Walden. They presented a series of significant changes at the 1986 General Assembly, including a new benevolent fund and a burial fund. And so in 1987, the 1/2 Social Security program was amended to be retained and become a part of the second benevolent fund. I'm going to explain those two moves in just a minute. So in 1987, new plan that called for a burial fund and a benevolent fund. The following year, they added to that, they submitted a resolution and the Assembly adopted a resolution to change the nature of the 1/2 Social Security benevolent fund. So let's talk about that. The benevolent and burial fund. First of all, the resolution called for a standing committee of 5. And initially it consisted of the 5 who drew up the plan. The committee would be elected every 2 years by the delegation. In order to maintain a consistency in operations, an election would be held on the current committee, the 5 men, where you take a vote and the 3 that get the most votes stay on the committee. So that you don't have the possibility that every 2 years you start all over with a brand new committee. So 3 men have to be retained each year on the committee. And then there's another election from nominations from the delegation where we elect 2 men to serve along with them. Now the other 2 that didn't get in the first ballot are free to be elected again. It's just that 3 of them have to stay on the board and all 5 of them could stay. But that's the way the benevolent committee is made up. The Church of God Mountain Assembly established in 1986 a burial fund. 10% of all the tithes sent in by the local churches is set aside and paid into a burial fund. Every licensed or ordained minister who tithes into his local church is eligible for a benefit. So every preacher in the Mountain Assembly that has credentials is entitled to a death benefit from the burial fund if they've been consistent in their tithes in their local church. And again, it's funded from tithe to tithe sent to headquarters. So that 10% of all the tithes sent to headquarters, 10% of that gets put into the burial fund for that benefit. Originally, the benefits started at $500. So any minister in the assembly that had credentials died, the assembly would give them $500, give their family $500. Now, again, 1986, $500 doesn't sound like a whole lot of money at all right now, but it's not. But in 1986, it wasn't going to bury anybody, but it was at least a help in preparing funerals. After 10 years of service, a minister would be entitled to an additional $350. After another 10 years of service, at 20 years, it went up to another $350. So that for 20 years of service, the maximum benefit would be $1,200. Every licensed and ordained minister in the assembly is eligible for that benefit. It doubled some years later in the 80s to where it started out at $1,000 and then added $700 and another $700 to a maximum of $2,400. And just about, I think 3 years ago, it doubled again. And so the current benefit is $2,000 with up to, the total benefit could be $4,800 now. And so, again, $4,800 may not be enough to totally bury somebody, but that's a good start. And in some cases, it may be adequate. It's not intended to be a replacement for life insurance, not by any means. That's not,
more like an assistance.
But yes, a supplement. And the idea is, I think for most families, you already have life insurance that's going to take care of the cost of the funeral and what have you, and maybe whatever else you might need. This is an added benefit that a family might take something to do in memorial. $4,800. I've got life insurance that'll bury me, but $4,800 might be enough that if my family wanted to, they could put that money into a scholarship. They could put that money into some sort of a mission gift. They could do something at the youth camp. So the idea is that it's not intended to bail you out of your trouble, but it could help. It certainly could help. And again, it's available for every minister in the assembly that's starting out. In 1988, that 10-year plan that had been set aside for the aged ministers was set to expire. And so in order to continue to assist the aged ministers who were part of that plan, that benefit would continue to be paid out of the burial fund. So we continued paying those ministers, and when they died, we continued paying their widows. The people who benefited from that were Roy Cornelius, Luther Gibson, and Clayton Lawson. And so Anita Gibson, Lassie Lawson, and Mary Cornelius were the ones who benefited from that program, but that came out of the burial fund. And so we were able to continue to provide help for them. It also provides a monthly benefit for every general overseer who has retired or their widow. So there's and I can't remember what the number, you have to look at the current bylaws, but they're out of the burial fund. We're also sending a monthly allotment to retired general overseers. That is, they're not full-time ministry anymore, or their widows, sending a benefit to them to help them. The burial fund is also used in such a way that, any given year, how many preachers do we have dying that are entitled to benefit? That is, there's always going to be money in this burial fund that's sitting there. Of course, it's invested, certificates of deposit, what have you. There's always money that is sitting there. And so the benevolent committee sometimes uses the burial fund to loan money to small churches who are able to borrow money at a cheaper rate of interest than they could borrow it from the bank. But the assembly still gets an interest off of off of the money. Instead of it just sitting there, for example, if it's sitting in a checking account, it's really not, if it's an interest-bearing checking account, it's not drawing anything at all. If you have a CD, even tying it up, you can't afford to tie the whole thing up for 5 years. Its interest rates on a 1-year CD are nothing anymore. They're just negligible. And so the idea is if you loan a portion of that to a local church, that a local church, for example, needed to put a new roof on their church, or a local church that needed to buy a new heating and air unit. The benevolent funding has the benevolent committee has the authority to loan that, because they're investing it. They have the money to loan, the power to loan that money out to a local church, and they usually put a cap. There's a certain percentage of it. Like they won't loan the whole fund, but a percentage of it is available to loan. In 1994, the Assembly passed a resolution that put a cap on the burial fund, so that at the close of any fiscal year, any amount in the burial fund that exceeds $100,000 reverts to, it is swept over to another part of the program, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But the idea is, we can bury every preacher in the assembly that dies this year without spending $100,000. And so, instead of keeping it all in the burial fund, and that balance continuing to climb higher and higher and just sitting there, they capped the burial fund at $100,000. And so now at the end of the fiscal year, whatever is in the burial fund in excess of $100,000 is swept. Let's talk about benevolent fund number 1. 10% of all ministers' tithes paid into headquarters is set aside in a benevolent fund on behalf of that minister. So every pastor who sends his tithes to headquarters, every evangelist conducting revival, and 10% of that offering of the revival is deducted and sent to headquarters. 10% of all ministers' tithes sent to headquarters for that minister is set aside in a benevolent fund on his account. At the age of 65, all funds plus accrued interest shall be his entitlement in either a lump sum or in monthly payments until it's exhausted. Now, that was later amended to the age of 62, but that's the benevolent fund number 1 is funded from ministers' tithes paid into headquarters. Every preacher who has any tithes at all sent to headquarters, 10% of that is immediately placed in the benevolent fund in an account with his name on it. And at age 65, 62 now, he is entitled to that either in a lump sum or he can get it in a monthly allotment. Let me talk about benevolent fund number 2. Benevolent fund number 2 is sometimes referred to as 1/2 Social Security, because that's where it comes from. Minister's tithes. But I mentioned 1966 that we provided a benefit where a minister could get up to half of his tithes back, to use for his retirement, to pay his Social Security bill or what have you. Now, since 1966, that has been the case. Now, in 1987, benevolent fund number 2 has been created so that instead of returning that money back to the minister, now that portion that he would have been sent back is now placed in benevolent fund number 2 in a separate account. Again, this is for full-time ministers who have, whose income from pastoring, this the tithes off of pastoring is sent to headquarters. That money is set aside in a separate account. And again, benevolent number 1 is 10%. Benevolent number 2 is up to 50% of the tithe set aside in a benevolent fund for him. He's fully vested in 5 years, so that after 5 years, if he wanted to make a withdrawal, he could withdraw the money. Now, you can only make withdrawals every 5 years, and so it is limited in how often you can take it out. But he's fully vested, so if you came into a family emergency crisis, you needed to, of course, here's the deal with both sets. When you do withdraw it, it is a fully taxable benefit. It's not a tax exempt retirement program like an IRA or something else like that would be. This is a benefit. It is a gift from the Church of God Mountain Assembly to the minister, and he gets a 1099 with it, and gets to pay taxes on it, and what have you. And so that's the other issue. Now, Benevolent Fund number 1, when it was originally established, it had an interest rate, and Benevolent Fund number 2 had another interest rate. So let's talk about the problem. Now, I've set the background. Now let's talk about the problem. Something's got to give. After the first full year of the 1/2 Social Security program, in 1988, we're 2 years into the program. After the first full year of the program, the total balance in both Benevolent Fund number 1 and Benevolent Fund number 2 was just around $30,000. Okay? So 1988, 2 years into the program, the total amount in Benevolent number 1 and Benevolent number 2 was just around $30,000. By 2000, just the amount transferred from the minister's tithes to the Benevolent Funds number 1 and 2, just the amount transferred, not the balance, just the amount transferred was $55,000. Okay? Additionally, the cap sweep that I talked about earlier, when the Benevolent Fund was capped in 1994 at $100,000, the Assembly voted to take that amount that was over $100,000 and divide it up equally into Benevolent Fund number 2, into the ministers that were participating in Benevolent Fund number 2. And so the cap sweep moved to the Benevolent Fund number 2 that same year was $41,000, just the cap sweep. So at the end of the year, the balance on Benevolent Fund number 1 was $268,000, and the balance on Benevolent Fund number 2 was $422,000. I'm going to talk about some of the issues at hand here. One of the things is there's more and more ministers getting involved, more and more full-time ministers. So more and more ministers are getting involved, and the more ministers are getting involved, the more money that's being sent to that program. The other thing is the amount of declining balances. The more this money that has been transferred from the general fund to the benevolent funds through those years, more money keeps being put into there, and the interest on it keeps accumulating to where the balances in that account were climbing higher and higher. By 2002, the closing balance on Benevolent Fund number 1, Benevolent Fund number 2, and the Burial Fund was a combined $1,008,876.13. Just over $1 million in those three accounts. Let me talk about declining interest rates in case you don't have a history in finance or what have you. In July 1984, the national average interest on a 5-year CD peaked at 12%. A 5-year certificate of deposit, you could get CDs that averaged 12%. In July 1987, the first year that the Assembly had Benevolent Fund number 2 created, in July 1987, it was 7%, the national average. The Assembly that year decided they would split the difference in Benevolent Fund number 1. So we're going to take the money that comes in, we're going to invest it in certificates of deposit. Men can't touch it till they're 65 or can't touch it for at least 5 years anyway. Okay? If we can get 7% of interest on the money that's coming in, we'll split the difference. Benevolent Fund number 1 paid 5.5%, and Benevolent Fund number 2 paid 9%. The higher interest rate went to the program with the higher balance, right, up to half of the money. The smaller interest rate went to the one that paid 10%. You understand? 5.5% for Benevolent number 1, 9% for Benevolent number 2. And you see the national average. By 1997, or I'm sorry, by 1992, the national average had dropped to 6%. By 97, it was 5.7. By July 2000, it was 6.16. July 2002, 4.25. July 2003, 2.45%. Keep following the trend. July 2010, it's 1%. July 2016, 5-year certificate of deposit. Last July, the national average was 0.86%. Okay? Now, what happens when the assembly has a benevolent fund that they're going to pay 9% interest to the account, and they have certificates of deposit that that are paying 7%. Where does the other 2% come from? It comes out of the general fund, right? 5.5%, interest rates. The declining interest rates combined with the climbing balances. You got more and more money to pay interest on, right? And you're getting less and less money from your return. And so something's got to give. But by 2002, the benevolent committee who sets the interest rates had never changed the interest rates on those accounts. In January 2002, General Secretary and Treasurer Al Newton reported to the benevolent committee that the declining interest rates and declining balances in our account was going, if we kept the interest rates at the same rate that we are now, he reported that we would be transferring approximately $37,000 to the Benevolent Fund number 1 and $62,500 to Benevolent Fund number 2 at the end of that fiscal year. At the current interest rates, the assembly, the amount that the assembly paid on the difference in the interest was going to be about $19,000 to Benevolent Fund number 1, $10,500 from CDs, and $87.50 would come from the general fund. Almost $9,000 from the general fund, and in the Benevolent Fund number 2, the amount of interest was going to be $47,250. And so we were looking at roughly $32,000 coming from the general fund on interest. And so he asked the benevolent committee to lower the interest rates and proposed that they lower the interest rate on Benevolent Fund number 1 from 5.5%. In other words, the general fund that year was going to be paying $150,000 to the benevolent fund. He was asking the benevolent committee to drop the interest rates on benevolent fund number 1 from 5.5% to 3.5%, drop the interest rate on benevolent fund number 2 from 9% to 6%, save the assembly $25,000 just from dropping the interest rates that much. Well, they agreed to do that very reluctantly. One member of the committee said, we knew at some point we were going to have to lower these interest rates, and they did. As those CD renewal rates continued to decline, at a later meeting, Brother Newton came back and asked again for the committee to drop the rates to the current rates that we were getting on the CDs. And the benevolent committee didn't like the idea of dropping the rates again so quickly after we just had dropped them. And so let's wait, another year and see what happens to the market and see, what have you. They eventually did drop the interest rates. Now the interest rates are set at roughly what we get from the CDs, roughly what we get for our investment. But by the time we responded, we were already in a financial crunch to be able to move that kind of money from the general fund into the May of 2003, by the way, was when the benevolent committee met and were asked again to drop the rates down to equal what we. Here's the dilemma. The system, the way it was set up originally, when you got 1/2 Social Security, you could get up to half of the amount of tithes you paid to the assembly that year. Yeah, you could get up to 1/2 of the tithes you sent. Now, the principle of tithing is such you're giving it to God. It's not yours to determine what you get. You're giving it to God. The church is choosing to give you back up to half of that amount. The way things change, not only with the Creation Benevolent Fund number 1 and number 2, there was the potential all of a sudden now it's 10% on one and up to 50% on the other. But then when you combine with that the prospect of interest on an accumulated balance, there have been men in the recent years who have got way more money in their benevolent fund than they paid that year in tithes because of the interest. And the money has to come from somewhere. And if it doesn't, what I pay in tithes, if I paid $4,000 in tithes, and the assembly gave me $8,000 to my benevolent fund, then the rest of that money had to come from somebody, from somebody else's tithes from somewhere else. Let's talk about the second issue: building buildings and buying property. And so we'll talk about the assembly's debt. Now, if you've been to the assembly any time in the last 15 years, there's been some talk about debt, and people always ask, "What are we in debt for? What's this?" So let's talk about that. We'll talk about the Florence Avenue properties. First of all, the Gibson Lawson building. This was the second tabernacle, the one built in 1942. We talked about that a couple of sessions ago. In 1942, built in time for the assembly that year, home to the convention until 1966. The building had offices on either side of the stage that served as an office for the general overseer and an office for the general secretary and treasurer. In 1966, the new tabernacle was erected when more property was purchased from the Jellicoe school system. We bought the old Jellicoe High School and built the tabernacle on that piece of property. And so the Gibson Lawson building, serving as the home to the assembly, was no longer. And so the old tabernacle was converted into a rooming house with a dozen or so apartments in it so that it could host guests during the week of the General Assembly. It would host foreign missionaries later on. When they came into the General Assembly, the basement would be used as it was used as a restaurant during the time that the assembly was open to feed people and what have you. And also the building would be used as a place to store mission equipment to prepare mission barrels. It became a missions building, to pack the mission barrels and this and that was the case until it was demolished. The J.E. Hatfield building is the building where our offices moved when the new tabernacle was built. The J.E. Hatfield building was a house. It was a building that was in the parking lot there on Florence Avenue. It was near the old Jellicoe High School. It was the old home economics building for the old Jellicoe High School. And so our general officials moved into that building in 1966. Office for the General Secretary and Treasurer, the Mission Director, the General Overseer. There was a conference room where the elders met. This was the headquarters office building from 1966 forward. I call them by these names. In the 1980s, the Assembly officially voted to designate those buildings and give them names. The Gibson Law, the old tabernacle was named after Luther Gibson and Clayton Lawson. The J. Hatfield building, named after Brother Hatfield, who served longer than any other man as our General Secretary and Treasurer. A fire in the early 1980s had done a lot of damage to the building, and by 1997, it was apparent that the building needed some work. And so in 1997, the Assembly voted to demolish both buildings, the Gibson Lawson building and the J. Hatfield building, and to build a new office building on the site of the old Gibson Lawson building, the old tabernacle. And so the new office building was built. Trustees recommended the construction of the new building on that site. The Assembly borrowed $265,000 to demolish the buildings and to erect the new office on its site. The new office building would contain a meeting conference room. There's 3 offices for the full-time general officials. There was a spare office that was included for future expansion, a records room, and a reception area in the new office building. And so, again, the Assembly went into debt to purchase that, to build the new headquarters building, and borrowed somewhere in the neighborhood of $265,000. Let's talk about the Moses Ellis Tabernacle. The new tabernacle was named after the general overseer and assistant general overseer at the time that it was built, Ira Moses and C.B. Ellis. At the 2005 General Assembly, the General Council voted to commission the trustee board to work out a lease agreement with the Jellicoe Church, where the Jellicoe Church would take over the tabernacle and relocate their church services to it. At the time, the roof of the tabernacle was in desperate need of repair. And so the Assembly was going to have to put a new roof on the tabernacle. Whether we leased it or didn't lease it, we were going to have to it was desperately needing a new roof. And so that year the Assembly borrowed $100,000 to put a new roof on the tabernacle, and at the same time signed a 99-year lease with the Jellicoe Church. And the Jellicoe Church took over the building and the renovations. They totally renovated the tabernacle, turned it around, and they would take over the rest of the maintenance and the renovation of the building and all the utilities except the month of August. Our lease agreement specifies that we pay the utilities for the month of August, presumably because of the General Assembly being held there. So those are the Florence Avenue properties. Let's talk about some of the other properties. In the mid-1980s, a minor dispute resulted in our purchasing property in the Florence Avenue parking lot in the mid-80s. A little bit later on, the same individual who owns a couple of other houses, one on Florence Avenue, one across the street, and 2 vacant lots on the corner, were also purchased at that same year. And I don't have the figures in front of me. I thought I did. I thought they were in my notes. How much we paid for the purchase of those properties. The 2 homes of Ronnie Dabney and of his mother on Florence Avenue, along with the vacant lot, they were purchased somewhere about 1998. And so we borrowed money from the bank to purchase those properties. So we have an outstanding debt in 1999. We have an outstanding debt for the new office building. We have an outstanding debt for the purchase of those properties. And in a few years, we're also going to have another $100,000 loan on, and I know I've went a little bit anachronistically. I'm not in chronological order, but talking about the tabernacle. I think that the first issue with purchasing that property was over the dispute, the parking lot. The driveway of that first home, the only way to access it was through the parking lot, through our parking lot. And it caused some issues. General Secretary and Treasurer at the time had some small children, that played and what have you. People were constantly, local teenagers were constantly coming and going. He wanted to put up a fence to keep that from happening, but it would block out the owner of that property. And so there was an issue when they did a little survey. He claimed, I said it's a minor dispute, he claimed that his property line extended a few feet over onto what we thought was our property. When they did the survey, our property line actually extended halfway into his kitchen. And so it was one of those issues where something's got to give. The opportunity to buy it, and then I think that started launching the, let's just keep expanding, let's just keep. Part of it's about controlling your neighbors. If you own the property, rent it out, and they rented it out and what have you. Our business is not the business of being landlords, but the idea was, it gave us some measure of control that we wouldn't have had. Let's talk about the Imperial Cantrell Manufacturing Company. You ever heard anybody talk about the Cantrell building? Imperial Cantrell Manufacturing had been manufacturing bronze bushings since 1925. They went out of business around 2000, and in the spring of 2001, they approached CGMA headquarters to see if they would be interested in purchasing the property. The factory building and the property sitting behind our current property, to ask and to inquire about the feasibility of that. In May, on May the 8th of 2001, a meeting at headquarters was held with the Finance Committee and the Trustee Board. Jasper Walden, Donnie Hill, Scott Isham, Fred Cornelius, Rick Massengill, Jerome Walden, Ken Massengill, and Ray Landis were those men that came along with the executive board. The meeting included communion and foot washing, and then an adjournment to walk through the Cantrell property. After the walkthrough, the trustees authorized the executive board to negotiate the purchase of the Cantrell property contingent upon a clean report of the EPA. The Finance Committee authorized the asking price. I think they were asking $250,000. The Finance Committee authorized the purchase of the property. They told the executive board, offer $175,000 and negotiate up to $225,000. Okay, Cantrell's counteroffer was $235,000, and they were firm on that. The Pentecostal World Fellowship took place in Los Angeles in May 29th through the 31st. The executive board was there. The last day of the conference, the general overseer asked to meet with the executive board. He wanted to discuss with them the purchase of the Cantrell property. He informed the rest of the board that when we meet again with the trustees and finance committee, that he was not going to recommend the purchase of the property. That he felt like it would limit the assembly's ability to grow future ministries by tying up financial resources to real estate. He said, we already have such significant debt. If we go into further debt, then it's going what else are we going to be able to do? And he said, I don't want the legacy of my tenure to be, buying real estate. I want to do ministry. And so the executive board got behind his decision, says, that's what you want to do? We're behind it. So at a joint meeting on June 5th of 2001, the trustees, finance committee, benevolent committee were present at that meeting. And for the first hour and a half, Brother Light presented he presented first of all the offer of the Imperial Cantrell, and then he updated the boards on the current financial obligations of the general fund. We still owed $150,000 on the headquarters office building, and still owed $81,000 on the Dabney properties. And we also were involved in helping some other churches with their financial needs. He then talked for the next hour and a half and shared his vision for future ministry in the Church of God Mountain Assembly. Starting new churches, further development of the National Men's Ministries, investment in the National Ladies Ministry, prayer ministry in the districts, retreats for youth, young evangelists and pastors and district overseers, evangelism, outreach directors, being able to help local churches to put on a second man to assist the pastor, to help local churches who were right at the threshold where if they just had a full-time pastor, maybe that pastor could take them to another level. He wanted to be able to come under and undergird for a year, helping churches to put a guy on full-time with the idea that once he's full-time, if we help him for that first year, he gets full-time, the church will grow, and the church can take care of it after that. And so basically, what he was saying was, there are better ways to spend $250,000. And so when he was finished sharing his vision, the committees responded by suggesting that it was possible to do ministry, to do the ministries that he was talking about, to share his vision, and to purchase that property. We can do both. And so the trustee board voted to purchase the Cantrell property for $235,000. The finance committee voted to borrow. They authorized the borrowing of $235,000. It was to be amortized for 15 years. But the intention was to pay $2,500 a month and then for 7 years, and then pay $113,000 in a balloon payment and have it paid off. That was the plan that they felt like that they could accomplish. The benevolent committee voted to loan the $235,000 to the general fund from benevolent fund number 2. Now, benevolent fund number 2, of course, is the minister's 1/2 Social Security retirement program. Now, some would say, well, don't that money belong to somebody else? And this, that, and the other. The technical answer is no, it doesn't, because it's not your money until you ask for it. You know, it's in the benevolent fund. It's got your name assigned to it, this, that, and the other, but you're not held accountable for it. You don't owe any taxes on it, or this and that and the other. If you leave the assembly and it's reverted to the burial fund or whatever the case may be, it's not your money until you ask for it. And so the idea was they would loan the money from the burial fund, or from the benevolent fund, and then the general fund would make the payments back to the assembly. So that instead of taking on an additional bank loan and the interest that we would be paying there, we're paying interest, but we're paying the interest that we were paying anyway. It's just now we don't have that $235,000 in a certificate of deposit, boosting the amount of interest that we would be making on it. And so they theorized it was cheaper to do that than it was to borrow money while continuing to pay that interest anyway. And so that's when we talk about the debt, it's the combination of a debt on the roof of the tabernacle, the debt of the new office building, and the debt of the purchase of the Cantrell property. Now, I will say the trustees, in approving the purchase of the Cantrell property, they also at that time gave permission to sell the properties, the Dabney properties. And so those properties were sold. The corner lot, the one corner lot is where the car wash is at now, and when you turn in to go there, and so those properties were sold in order to reduce the amount of debt. Now, the third thing is the 2002-2004 term of the General Secretary and Treasurer. Let me set again some background by talking about the office of General Secretary and Treasurer and the tenure of office limitations. Brother Hatfield was the clerk in 1940 and became the General Secretary and Treasurer in 1944 when the new form of government was instituted. He had served for 34 years in that capacity without having left office. In 1970, the tenure of office limitations that we talked about in the last session went into effect to where the Brother Hatfield had 4 years remaining that he could serve in the office of General Secretary and Treasurer. And so 1974, the tenure of office limitations forced Brother Hatfield out of office, and Clayton Lawson was elected to the office of General Secretary and Treasurer. Clayton Lawson, who I've talked about and bragged about on many occasions in this class about his capabilities, he was a popular preacher. He was capable of many things, but the duties of this office were not in his repertoire. And Clayton realized that the job allowed him to hire a secretary. Brother Hatfield had been allowed to hire a secretary for up to 3 days a week. And so Brother Hatfield hired James Cox Jr. as his secretary for $54 a week for 3 days' work, and he assisted Brother Lawson in completing the duties of the General Secretary and Treasurer. In 1976, Brother Lawson declined running for office. James Cox was elected to the position himself. He served in that capacity for 4 years. And in 1980, J. Hatfield returned to the office. Remember 1980, and I talked about Clayton Lawson becoming the General Overseer. We went back to the future, where here we are again. Brother Hatfield was elected to the office of General Secretary and Treasurer. So much had changed in the 6 years that he had been out of office. So much had changed in bookkeeping, so much had changed in the growth of the assembly that Brother Hatfield was overwhelmed. The General Secretary and Treasurer would continue to get finance even up to the week of the assembly. And sometimes he was continuing to modify his report and make changes to his report during the week of the assembly. The assembly lasted all week long, and sometimes the treasurer's report be toward the end of the week or what have you. And so Brother Hatfield passed away in his sleep on the night, early morning of Thursday of the General Assembly in 1981. At the elders' meeting that year, the elders decided that they could hire Charles Cox, Brother Jim's brother, to assist and do the job of the Secretary and Treasurer until the following assembly. Now, they had an Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer. He wasn't willing to, and I talked about the succession. The succession of office wasn't in place at the time, than what we have now. But Charles did do the job for several months. He later resigned, and Jackie Cox, Jim's wife, Jim was the Assistant Overseer Mission Director at the time. She would serve as a bookkeeper until the next assembly. 1982, Ron Shelton, Clayton's nephew, was elected to the office of General Secretary and Treasurer. He served in that capacity for 4 years. 1986, James Cox returns to the office for another completion of the four-year term. In 1990, James W. Kilgore was elected to the office of General Secretary and Treasurer. And I mentioned the tenure of office limitation changed in 91, so now he's entitled to 6 years. And so in 1996, there was an attempt that year to change the tenure of office on the General Secretary and Treasurer and take tenure of office completely off of the office. It failed. And so we had an election. And so in 1996, Alfred Newton Jr. was elected to the office of General Secretary and Treasurer, and he served in that capacity for the next 6 years. So let's get up to 2002 then. The 2002 election, there were 3 men nominated, 2 declined, only one man accepted the nomination, and he ran unopposed and did not get elected. He got right at 37% of the vote. The vote was 66 to 113. He did not get elected. And so the floor was reopened for nominations for the job. 10 men were nominated and none accepted. And so the election of General Secretary and Treasurer was tabled until the following day. And the Executive Board was asked to meet in executive session and to discuss the situation. And so they did. On Wednesday, there were 3 men nominated, 2 accepted, and Roger L. Webb was elected General Secretary and Treasurer that year. He'd been pastoring the church at Oliver Springs. He was elected. I mentioned Brother Lawson's abilities earlier, and I'll just say again, in the same way, Brother Webb's abilities were not specialized in this particular area either. And he was in over his head. the assembly had benefited from, I mentioned the secretary, Brother Cox had served as secretary for Clayton Lawson. The other general secretary and treasurers had been able to hire an office assistant, an executive administrative assistant, who would help the general secretary and treasurer primarily, but also with the other duties. Amy Prophet had been serving as the administrative assistant to that position since 1992. She'd served with Brother Kilgore. She'd served the entire 6 years under Brother Newton, and she continued to serve in that position with Brother Webb. In March of 2003, March 11, 2003, the Finance Committee met in a special meeting necessitated by the resignation of Amy Prophet to discuss her request for vacation and severance and overtime that was due, and to discuss the salary of a to-be-hired executive administrative assistant. Without Amy there to help Brother Webb get the reports prepared, when the Finance Committee met in mid-April at the end of the third quarter finance report, there were some inconsistencies. The report was not really up to par. There were some issues. By the time the fourth quarter report in late July was finished, and the Finance Committee came and met again, the finance report was not ready. This is about 2 weeks before the General Assembly. The books had not yet been closed. And so on August the 5th, 2003, at the General Assembly, the finance report was not completed. The report wasn't ready. And so it was moved, and I mentioned sometimes in the past, the report would be done by the end of the week, and Brother Webb wasn't close enough to completion to have that possible. So it was moved to refer the report of the Finance Committee, to remove the report to the Finance Committee. We'll refer it to them to bring it to completion. Brother Webb committed at that meeting to having the report concluded by the end of August. And so the motion was amended to authorize the Finance Committee and the General Secretary and Treasurer to complete the report and to call a special session of the Board of Elders and Finance Committee to act on behalf of the General Council to receive the report. There was another amendment offered that every delegate would be mailed a copy of the report after it was completed, after the Finance Committee got together and accepted it, and before the Elder Board met to formally accept it on behalf of the General Council. Finance Committee met in early September. Following, Brother Webb had concluded to have it done by the end of August. Finance Committee met in early September, and the report was still not completed. They met on September the 30th. The Elder Board, the Executive Board, the Finance Committee met, and the audit of the report was attempted. Brother Webb had a report that hadn't been looked at by the Finance Committee, and so the Elder Board said, well, why don't the Finance Committee look at that while we go to lunch, and we'll come back, and if it's in order, we'll accept it. And so they went to lunch, and a few hours later they came back, and the report was still not ready to be completed. And so the Elder Board hired James Kilgore to assist Brother Webb in completing the report. He was supposed to come and work I can't remember how many days it was. You'll have to refer to your minutes in the assignment. But to come and to assist Brother Webb in completing the report. In November, on November the 11th, the Finance Committee met for their first quarter report from the new fiscal year. We're into a new fiscal year, and the old report was still not finished yet. And so they came back a week later, and still no report. And there was an elders meeting in December that brought no resolution. And finally, on May the 24th, 2004, at the request of the Finance Committee Chairman, the elders were convened one more time, and at that meeting, they suspended Roger Webb from the office with pay, and the Assistant General Secretary and Treasurer was retained to fulfill the duties of the office until the General Assembly. So in 2004, Jim Kilgore was elected. In 2009, a resolution amended the tenure of office limitations of the General Secretary and Treasurer to the 6 consecutive terms. In 2015, this was interpreted to have begun in 2010, and so Brother Kilgore continues to serve in that capacity. So, do you have a question?
I just said fun year.
Yes, by all means. Let's talk about the combined effect of the 3 challenges. First of all, the Assembly faced a great financial difficulty. During this time, the Finance Committee had also decided to co-sign on some loans of a couple of churches in the Assembly, and one of those churches was unable to make their payment, and rather than default on the loan, the Assembly made the payment for the next several years. So combine the strain of the climbing interest rates with the accumulated debt and paying interest as opposed to receiving it from the Benevolent Fund Number 2 loan to purchase the Cantrell property, with the lack of the financial accountability in that the 2003 finance report still has never been satisfactorily completed. There was no minute book printed in 2003. And so obviously it hurt the Assembly financially. In 2002, the total receipts for the general fund were reported at an all-time high, $659,094.48. Now, adjusted for inflation in 2017, that's somewhere around $980,000. Okay? Adjusted. So 2 years later, they had dropped, when we actually had a finance report, the income had dropped less than 4%, or to a little bit more than 4%. And in 2005, it dropped nearly another 16% in total income. It would be 2008 before the receipts would be that high again by less than $800. But remember, adjusted for inflation, it's still 16% lower than what it was in 2002. The Assembly's net receipts reached an all-time high in 2009 of $696,448. Again, adjusted for inflation, it's still 11% lower than in 2002. And so you see, I told you it's 902,000. The equivalent in 2017 is $902,959.44. We'll need that much income coming into the Assembly to be as high as we were in 2002. And so the lack of finances, putting a strain on the Assembly, also coupled with the low morale. The experience, the combined experiences left a bad taste in people's mouths. Some people resented the fact that we purchased a piece of property for so much money, and they didn't get a voice in that. They didn't get a vote in that. Other people resented the fact that you borrowed my money to do it and didn't even ask me. Coming from the Benevolent Fund. And so the combination of, I mentioned the election in 2002. During that course of time from 2002 to 2004, there were 5 elders meetings. 2 regular elders, there were 5, from 2003 to 2004, there were 5 elders meetings that were held within a year's time, and all of them related some way or another to the job of the General Secretary and Treasurer, and nothing really being done about it contributed to a low sense of morale. Now you can see the low morale demonstrated in the amount of finance that's sent to headquarters, but it can also be seen in attendance at national functions. The attendance at the General Assembly dropped. One quantifying measure is the delegate count. If you're counting people in a worship service, it all depends on who's counting. And it all depends on what their perspective is about whether or not the crowds are better this year than they were last year. But one quantifying measure is the delegate count. Realizing that the delegate count in election years can always be higher than the delegate counted in off years. In the 1980s, the delegate count at the beginning of business in the election years averaged 147. In the 1990s, it averaged 170. In 2000, it peaked at 203. In 2002, it was 177. And in 2004, it hit an all-time high of 216. It dropped to 176 2 years later, and since then has averaged 135, including the all-time low of 122 in 2014. Another contributing factor was the divided assembly of 2004. An all-time high, 216 delegates, and yet the assembly was divided. I mentioned the tenure of office limitations in 1970 went into effect. In 1974 was the first election that was affected by the tenure of office. Now, that year we were changing general overseers we changed overseers in 72 because Ira Moses declined for running for the additional term that he was inclined to. But in 1974, that year, 2 men ran for general overseer, the incumbent and another. And 2 men ran for assistant general overseer, the incumbent and another. Since that time, until 2004, no one had ran against an incumbent general overseer with tenure left since in the 30 years since then. And only one time had the incumbent assistant had someone run against him. In 2004, both the incumbent general overseer and assistant general overseer were challenged. In the election of general overseer, the difference in 5 ballots, if 5 delegates had voted the other way, would have been a different overseer. The same thing true with in the assistant overseer's election, 3 changing their vote would have been the other way. We changed general overseers and assistant general overseers that year, and again, low morale because of that factor. Another contributing factor to low morale. Also another measure is the loss of ministers. In any given year, any number of ministers can leave the assembly. In the 5 years before 2000, the CGMA averaged losing about 5 ministers per year, ministers who left the fellowship. In the 5 years following 2003, that average climbed to nearly 15 a year. And let me say this. In June of 2017, I'm going to talk about turning it around. In June of 2017, the Cantrell building caught on fire and burned. The insurance settlement on that check was received in September, $590,000. That will pay the assembly's debts, all of the assembly's debts. I don't know if they've technically written the checks and done what they need to do and what have you, but the assembly will be out of debt at the end of this fiscal year because of that. And so that certainly helps. That certainly helps by all means. Turning things around. I'm going to mention just a couple of other things in closing. One of the things that help turn is just the reception of new ministers. While we're losing preachers, we're also gaining preachers. And quality men of God that have joined our ranks since that time, putting us in a position to face the future, this 21st century, with progressive-minded, educated, anointed men of God. Another thing is a renewed sense of brotherhood. And I think there has been a concerted effort from a young generation that refuses, that have covenanted together to say, we're not going to get caught up in the divisions, we're not going to get caught up in the politics, we're not going to get caught up, and have made an effort to rise above that and to build one another up and encourage one another. I think social media has played a part in that it has brought the assembly together in a way that before wasn't capable. It's one thing to read about news in the Gospel Herald. You have no way to respond back, But when I see it posted on social media, I can respond almost immediately. Prayer requests, we can pray almost immediately for needs. The technological advances of our day have made it, have really assisted in bringing the assembly together in a way that wasn't possible before that. I really believe, and I've said that on the floor of the delegation, I really believe that we have a general overseer that genuinely cares about the welfare of our ministers and our churches. And I think he has made an effort to reach out to families that are bereaved and families that are in sickness, ministering to our families. And I believe it's motivated from genuine concern as a chaplain to our organization. And it is that sense, that burden being brought to the rest of the body that has helped to it's hard to be mad at somebody when you're praying for them, for the Lord to heal them or for God to comfort them. And so I think that has had a lot to do with it as well. And of course, the relief of debt, the more fiscal responsibility of the benevolent fund. The part-time youth director has contributed to some of that. And then of course, the insurance claim has made it, has turned all of that around financially. And we'll add one more thing to that that's not in the PowerPoint. And that is this, what we're doing right now. The commitment to education. The things I talked about, the Christian education department, the preparation for the future, I really think is something that is helping to turn the assembly, better preparing our people for the future. And part of that is, you guys are part of that, because understanding our past in a lot of ways is the key to moving toward the future. Anybody got anything you want to